As you may be aware, Vermont, New England is transitioning away from fossil fuels. No big news for this room. Fossil fuel generated electricity towards renewable wind and solar power. And it's going to be critical, this is the context of today's lecture, to manage the intermittent nature of the electricity that we produce from wind and solar. So in other words, how does New England get to 100% renewable energy future when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing? Okay? Good starting point. One idea, which we're going to hear a lot about this afternoon, is to create two-way power lines between New England and Canada so that we can ship excess electricity from wind and solar generated in New England north for use in Quebec, allowing them to use less of their hydroelectric power. And when New England needs more electricity, the opposite, right? Quebec sends us their now excess electricity from hydro dams. In essence, Dr. Parsons is proposing to use Quebec's massive hydro resources to store electricity from New England's renewables and release it for use when we need it. This is the premise for what we're going to explore this afternoon. But before we get to the lecture, we have some preliminary remarks by three friends of the University of Vermont. First, I'd like to introduce Josh Begnato, a Senior Vice President at TDI New England, a Renewable Energy Vermont board member, and a very proud Vermonter. Josh, please.
So can you hear me? Okay, now great. Happy to be here this afternoon. Lots of friends and colleagues in the crowd. Hopefully there's some UVM students here as well. So I'm here this afternoon. I'm going to talk very quickly. I wear two hats in front of you today. My first hat is I'm on the Renewable Energy Vermont board. We call ourselves REV. REV, for those who don't know, is Vermont's Renewable Energy Trade Association. We have over 100 members that are comprised of utilities, businesses, nonprofits, and individuals, all working towards 100% renewable energy future for Vermont. We have our conference coming up October 18th and 19th. If you want to know more about that, some REV folks are in the back corner of the room. And we're also going to be trying to get some legislation through the Vermont legislature this next year to get Vermont's renewable energy standard to 100% renewable energy by 2030. So lots of work happening at REV. I also come to you sort of my second hat, which is a clean energy developer focused in New England for the past 2 decades. And I'll just offer sort of 3 thoughts. I've read some of Dr. Parsons' work. I'm sort of in this industry. So from an innovation perspective, I can say that a little bit about what you're hearing today is actually happening right now. So my company, TDI, is building a project called CHPE, Chippy, with our partners from Hydro-Quebec. We are under construction in New York. We are building a 375-mile buried HVDC transmission line from south of Montreal to Queens, New York. It will power 20% of New York City, and at some point, and that technology is capable of bidirectional use if at some point New York wants to use it that way and Quebec wants to use it that way. So that's the first thing. From the second point I'd make is, from an economic and Vermont-centric position, clean energy is a major job producer today. We got great solar companies here. We're struggling with wind a little bit. We've got a great leader on the transmission side with Velco and our utilities, but we don't have a coastline. And every other New England state has a coastline. And offshore wind is coming to those states. And it's a big industry. And there's a lot of jobs, and there's a lot of money. And Vermont is not able to participate in that unless we can get innovative and figure how we can tap into that offshore market. I think you're going to hear more about that today as well. The last thing is, from a climate perspective, wind and solar generation receive most of the attention in New England. They're kind of the headliners, but we know transmission is the backbone. And we know that to meet the region's clean energy goals, we have to think outside the box. We have to work regionally. We have to maximize the efficiency of all these clean energy assets. And that includes, probably first and foremost, transmission. So you're going to hear a lot more about all that. today from Dr. Parsons and other speakers, and thanks for having me speak, and thank you for coming, everybody.
Okay, so next up we're going to hear from Carrick Johnson. Carrick is with the Vermont Electric Power Company, VELCO, for more of an industry perspective. Carrick is the Chief Innovation and Communications Officer for VELCO. Carrick, come on up.
Good afternoon. I actually thought there'd be more people here, but this is an excellent turnout. Thank you for coming. I also am a grateful Vermonter in addition to being prideful, and I would say this. A couple things about VELCO you may not know that we like to make sure people are aware of. We're your hometown transmission team, but more importantly, our governance and the way the money works. On the issue of governance, we're owned by 17 distribution utilities and a public benefits corporation. There is no other transmission utility in the United States constructed thusly. Secondly, the money. The revenue we make, the profits we make at VELCO are returned to our distribution utility owners, but they in return are required to credit those revenues to their customers. So in effect, if we do our job right, every dollar we save or every dollar we earn above what we're required to earn goes back to benefit customers. So what's our motivation? Our motivation is keep people safe, keep the grid reliable, and in our vernacular, help create a sustainable Vermont. And when we say sustainable, that's many dimensions. That can be, do we have effective leadership? Are we decarbonizing on schedule? What makes Vermont more sustainable? And we have challenges, and we know that. In terms of transmission, for right now, what we're first trying to do is get more out of the system we have. There's existing waste in the system we have. We can do a better job managing through data and the like, getting closer and a better sense of our system, going deeper and broader into the system to better understand what generation is on, where it is, when it's off, and how we can better utilize its particular strengths and weaknesses with the regional grid. That's some of the things we're embarking upon today. We're also in the midst of expanding our fiber optic network. VELCO was one of the first utilities in the nation to really see what the value of fiber optics and how it could help increase reliability and innovation for a transmission system. We're expanding that by 600, 800 miles right now. So in effect, we have a statewide utility network for transmission, we have a statewide network for fiber optic delivery, and we have a statewide radio system for emergency and day-to-day operations. We're in about 172 communities. So we have quite a footprint. We understand and we try and stay connected to what Vermonters are looking at. Right now, the challenge for us is we have a window to build transmission. I think Energy Action Network just came out. We're not on track to meet the goals that we need to meet. Working with REV, working with Energy Action Network, VEIC, our customer owners, Green Mountain Power, Burlington Electric Department, Vermont Electric Co-op, and the like, we're trying to figure out how best to unlock the value of in-state generation, even as we bring in the wholesale type of power that we need to affect meaningful change, both for Vermont and for the region. We have an incredible geostrategic position here, sitting as we are between New York and Quebec and the rest of New England. How do we leverage that position? We have in the past, there's a line that goes through the Northeast Kingdom. We had a friend who is relatively new to Vermont, just learned that term, through the Northeast Kingdom, where there's an existing transmission line that for decades has served the purposes and connected us to Quebec. We have an incredible relationship with Hydro-Quebec. We'd like to build upon that. I think most studies, maybe you'll mention this, Dr. Parsons, have talked about we need at least 2 or 3 more ties. But for us, one of the reasons why we're excited about today here, Dr. Parsons, is the better job we do in capturing value and telling the story of the value that's captured, the more support we can earn for our projects. The more support we earn for our projects, the lower the costs they are because we won't have people disagreeing. The better job we do in earning support for our projects, the more reliable our grid will be because we're building stuff when we actually need to build it instead of spending time in courtrooms and hearing rooms and the like. So the more we understand what that value proposition, how we can do a better job through studies and building upon the work that Dr. Parsons does, the better we see, therefore, we can be of better service to Vermont, which is, again, is our role. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carrick. I'd like to now introduce Senator Keisha Ram Hinsdale. Keisha is a graduate of the Rubenstein School, a 6-term state legislator, former vice chair of House Natural Resources and Energy, current chair of Senate Economic Development, Housing, and General Affairs. Keisha was also the 2002 recipient of the Renewable Energy Vermont Legislator of the Year Award and the EPA Region 1 Government Service Award. Keisha is also an adjunct professor of structural inequality and environmental justice at the Vermont Law School. Senator Ram Hinsdale.
So I think you may have heard 2002, but it was 2022, only because I was still in high school then. Even though I did have Professor John Erickson as one of my teachers, and facilitated a meeting for the Gund Institute today, and was just reminded that this is a really special place to think about innovation and how to tie that to what's best for Vermont, the country, and the planet. I looked back I have my baby in the back, Mira, she's 5.5 months old, so apologies in advance for any noise you hear, and I'm here with our new au pair who just got here from Jamaica, Terethia, and I never miss an opportunity to talk about why it's UVM and not UVT or UV, because we're not just the University of Vermont, we're the University of the Green Mountains. And in many contexts, people often think, of course, I'm looking around and they go from green to orange and it's because we have such beautiful foliage. But it's also because we have limestone in our hills, just like, the White Mountains, it's not just because they have snow. And when I think about that, I also think about how much Vermont has been a leader in having truly green mountains and having the first wind turbine in the country, in fact, installed here, and in continuing to lead in ways that other states might be stymied in their efforts. But we don't have the market cornered on that, and we need to keep the exchange of ideas going so that we don't stagnate. And I'm glad to see students here, and maybe I'm preaching to the choir for the students that are here, but I'm a UVM graduate, and sometimes we kind of want to ignore the economy and ignore energy production and just sort of flip on and off the lights and say, like, we should, each have our own little solar panels attached to our backpacks and down with big energy. But that's simply not the way things work, and it's really important that we be part of the conversation to steer that energy production much more towards renewables and green energy. My baby Mira was born on April 13th in the hospital here, and she shares a birthday with her great-great-grandfather, her great-great-great-grandfather. My great-great-grandfather, Sir Gangaram, was the main architect and engineer of Lahore, Pakistan. At the time, it was India. And we finally had the opportunity to go 75 years after partition to Lahore and also the outskirts where he did a lot of rural development. We went to see a hydropower facility he built about 100 years ago in 1924. It's still operating, and it powers 38 villages in rural Pakistan. And if you visit this particular power station, it's incredible. It looks kind of like a Wes Anderson movie inside because it's so simple and bright, and it just relies on a 10-foot drop in the water. They have just a few staff who pull the lily pads away from the grates so the water can flow. And, when I went inside, there's all these fancy folks trying to talk to me, and I said, I just want to meet the person who keeps this place running and has for however many decades. And, this very humble man comes forward and tells me his father worked at the power plant and he's teaching his son how to run the power plant. And so, for me, it wasn't just about, okay, look at what my great-great-grandfather built 100 years ago. It was who's kept it operating for so long, who's made sure that it's able to function 100 years later and produce power for people with no new parts, I can guarantee you. And so, I think a lot about those kinds of stories that, underneath the bedrock of what we all try to do to realize our fullest potential has to be power and energy. And it's created so much opportunity since the days of my great-great-grandfather. And yet now a new generation is growing up thinking, is fossil fuel energy going to take us all out? Is this the end of opportunity? Is this the end of, possibility and change? And, thanks to people like Dr. Parsons, it's certainly not. In fact, a legislator looks at this and says, yes, we need more flexibility in the grid, we need more multi-directional power exchange, and we need to harden the grid at the same time. I think hopefully all of you know, we're coming out of such a devastating flood recovery period, into such a devastating flood and into the recovery period where, these questions will be front and center. How do we keep having functioning communities, local jobs, and still keep the lights on and make sure that people have safety, warmth, and power through an unpredictable climate future? So conversations like this are really wonderful for us to have. I think what Peter Sterling, my good friend, and Renewable Energy Vermont, great leader, trusted partner, wanted me to talk about is the unfortunate side of things, which is the politics, that bad politics can get in the way of good policy and good ideas. Thankfully in Vermont, we're still doing better than most states in the country in terms of our ability to get along and advance good ideas. But, that's not always the case with a Republican governor and administration when you have a part-time legislature, that really relies on industry partners and the best scientists for good ideas and then gets stymied by, our public service department or people who are not sharing that information or innovating with us. And so, we also implore that you pay attention to what's going on in Vermont politics because it really does make a difference and it matters. In fact, 2 of the new members of the Senate Natural Resources Committee, Ann Watson, a high school science teacher, and Becca White, a recent graduate of the University of Vermont who was on the debate team, are the 2 new members of the Natural Resources Committee and are completely changing the conversation already. So who you elect makes a tremendous difference and will accelerate us into a renewable energy future. As chair of economic development and a past leader in natural resources and energy, I'm able to say to my colleagues, climate resilience is no longer a one committee conversation. Every single one of our committees needs to be having this conversation: economic development, transportation, education, you name it. So this kind of exchange of ideas and partnerships is what will drive us forward. We need to be thinking constantly about how we keep our majority in the legislature. We have overridden the governor on energy policy in recent years. And so, we don't always like to think about or talk about the politics, but Renewable Energy Vermont and other partners have been great at helping us stay educated and informed as citizen legislators, and also make sure that we have the people around the table that we need to make smart decisions and meet the moment. We are in a very difficult time, and we're going to have to meet the moment for my baby's future, for many of you who are graduating and what you want to accomplish, and your hopes and dreams. So it's a privilege to be here always and to join Renewable Energy Vermont. And please stay in touch so that we can do this work together. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Senator. So on to this afternoon's main event. It's really a privilege and a great pleasure to introduce Dr. John Parsons from MIT. Dr. Parsons is the Deputy Director for Research at MIT's Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research. His work focuses on the valuation and financing of investments in the energy industry, as well as the problems of risk in energy and environment markets, and, of course, the transition to a low-carbon economy. He has taught corporate finance at MIT's Sloan School of Management, at the Columbia Business School, and City University's Baruch College. Dr. Parsons has also served as an associate member of the Energy and Environmental Markets Advisory Committee of the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and has been a visiting scholar at the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. He holds a BA in economics from Princeton University and a Ph.D. in economics from Northwestern University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Parsons.
Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for the University of Vermont Office of Research and the Resilient Energy Consortium and Renewable Energy Vermont for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Look forward to your questions and discussions. It'll be a great pleasure. So first of all, the title is about something new, two-way trade in green electrons. Some of the speakers here have already hinted that that's a good way to look at what we need in New England, but it is not the way we look at it now. So what I'm going to try to do is explain to you how we're looking at it now and why we need to look at it differently and how that can be helpful. It says here on the title slide, deep decarbonization. That's not yet where we are, but that's where we're all heading. And that's what's going to create a new situation that requires that we fashion our relationships a little bit differently. Obviously, New England, New York, Quebec have had a long, long history together. Economic development has been intertwined, even energy development with the Niagara Falls and various other projects through the decades have been intimately intertwined. So that's nothing new. But we always have to recreate that relationship and that economic development for a new age, and the deep decarbonization really puts new demands that we use the electricity system and our different resources and the different strengths that we have to fashion a new economic relationship. So that's what I'm hoping to talk to you about, all right? But first, I'm going to give you a little bit of preliminaries. I'm presenting you completed research from something that is past results, but it's an ongoing research project. There are a lot of facets to this problem of how can Canadian hydropower be integrated with New England and New York's development towards deep decarbonization. They have their own objectives that have to be taken into account. So that's a long list of many research issues that we could talk about. I'm going to focus on one of them, but we can talk about all of them. We have to look at it from a 2050 perspective, by which I mean there are things we need to do today and tomorrow, and they're pretty clear. We need, I steal this slogan from the Jigar Shah, who leads the US Department Loan Programs Office, deploy, deploy, deploy. There's lots to be done today. Fortunately, there's a lot of money around to do it with the Inflation Reduction Act, but money doesn't solve all the problems, so there's a ton of work to figure out how to get new clean energy resources onto the grid. I'm not going to address those problems. I'm looking a little further out to 2050. The longer term is much less clear. The grid is a complicated assembly. There are lots of technologies. Technologies are being developed. We're really making a huge transformation of the grid, and we don't exactly know all of the pieces of that huge transformation. So how it's all going to come together is a little bit unclear. But what we're focused on right now is when we really go, if we succeed in all this deploy business, then we're still going to have a little ways to go. And that little ways to go at the end turns out to be quite difficult. So we're a research organization. Our job is to look a little bit further and try to find problems that need some thinking and some work to fashion out, and then we come up with some results, and people with more experience in the industry and deal with all of the subtleties and difficulties of implementing those things carry them out. Last thing I want to mention is focus and context. I'm going to present to you some specific research results about how Canadian hydropower can best be utilized. I'm going to focus a lot on cost. That's what I do as an economist, and optimization. But there are big questions about economic development at hand that touch on lots of issues. And climate and greenhouse gases are complicated. Economic development is complicated. Economic development for who and how. I'm happy in the Q&A to talk about that stuff. We can go in any direction you want to go, but for the moment, I'm going to be speaking very narrowly on cost issues. All right, what we did in this research that I'm going to present is something which is a common tool of people who are working on power systems. It's called capacity expansion and dispatch modeling. You look out at how the system has to supply power to customers 24/7, 365 days a year. People have their hours where peak demand and seasons of peak demand. And then you have to look at all of the available generation technologies that have different characteristics, different costs, capital investment costs, operating costs, and we have to put them together to serve that load. We have to ask about the transmission connections that exist, what kind of emissions constraints, so we're on a path to net zero, what does that constrain the system to do? And what the model does is find the least cost system that serves load, provides reliable electricity, and meets that emission constraint. We're going to focus on New York, New England, and Quebec. That's what this study did. And we're looking out at 2050. What are the forecasts for load and the forecast for the technology costs? My crystal ball is probably just as bad as your crystal ball. So we have to have different scenarios to figure out how robust might the answers be depending upon what happens. In the research, we evaluate transmission expansion, so new lines. Do they lower the system cost or not? But I'm going to focus today on talking to you about utilization of the lines, not so much on expansion, but we can go there. So I want to first, I'm sorry, you're listening to an economist and a researcher, so I'm going to try to define a concept for you that's key in economics. You have goods that are substitutes and you have goods that are complements. Goods that are substitutes are two things that can do the same task or supply the same need. And if you have more of one good, or if one good is cheaper, then you need less of the other good. They substitute for one another, apples and pears. I mean, no offense to some people who have a specific preference for one or the other. Then there are complementary goods, goods which go together to serve a particular need. And so if you have more of one, you will need more of the other in order to get the job done. And here's where I start by saying, we're going to talk about something new. New Englanders think of imports of Quebec hydropower as a substitute for investments in wind and solar, or we have historically. We look around and say, how can we reduce carbon emissions? We want to use less fossil fuels. We could build more wind. We could build more solar. Oh, let's go import more hydropower. They are substitutes for one another. If we have more hydropower, then we don't need to as urgently build as much wind. And I claim that in the long run, that has to change. We don't want to think of them as substitutes. We want to think of that hydropower as something that's a little bit different and can be a complement to our investments in wind and solar. So now, once again, playing the pedant here, I'm going to teach you about a particular tool of analysis we use in electricity systems. Those of you who know electricity systems will have seen load duration curves. I'm pretty confident none of you have ever seen a transmission duration curve, but that's what this is. So right now in New England, we have a 2 gigawatt connection with Quebec. So that's why you see on the vertical axis there, transmission flows goes up to 2 gigawatts. And then on the horizontal axis, we have the hours of the year. They're not sorted in calendar order. They're sorted in the first hour of the year in this thing is the hour when we import most from Canada. And the last hour of the year is the hour that we import least from Canada. And what you can see on there is we're almost always importing a lot. Then there's a zero line in the middle. And we never go below zero. We never sell power up to Quebec. Now, this is in 2018. There may have been some occasions when we did otherwise, but I don't know. And so what I claim is that means we're using Hydro-Quebec as baseload power. And to emphasize the word baseload, I'm going to think about nuclear, which is clearly baseload. We have nuclear plants in New England. I can do a generation load curve for duration curve for the nuclear plants in New England, and I scaled them to fit the exact 2 gigawatts of transmission capacity. It's almost the same curve. So we're basically looking to Quebec imports as if it's another nuclear plant that can supply power into New England, all right? That's how we're behaving today. And what our research shows, the research asks, how will we operate, how will we invest in the generation in 2050, and how will we operate the system in 2050? Now, let's suppose we don't build any new lines. Don't get frightened. Let's just suppose for the moment we don't build any new ones, so I'm going to keep looking at this line. What would be the best way to use this line in 2050? Totally differently. For half of the year, we would be importing. But there's another quarter of the year out on the right when we would be exporting power to Quebec to the limit of the transmission capacity. That's totally different than what we do now. All right, and that's what I want you to come to understand as we need to look to Quebec differently than we do now. We look to them as substitutes now, and we need to look to them as complements. And the reason it's complements here was already described. This two-way trade means when the wind is not blowing, we can take power from Quebec, but when we have excess wind, we can deliver power to Quebec. And that's what would be going on in the right of this diagram. So let me carry this forward a little bit more. Let me give you a little of the substance. I focused on the transmission line. But let's talk about what a generation system would look like. So this column shows you all the different generation in the New England grid back in 2018. So it's a little less than half fossil fuels. There's a teeny bit of coal in that New Hampshire plant, lots of gas-fired generation, right? Then there's back in 2018, maybe it was still 3 nuclear plants, but now we're down to 2. A little bit of run-of-river hydro throughout New England, some solar at that time, very small, some onshore wind at that time, very small. And you have net imports from Quebec at the top there. That aqua color is net imports from Quebec. So that's the 2018 system. What does our modeling tell us the system needs to look like in 2050? Not needs to, there are many pathways to net zero, but here's one pathway to net zero, and it's the one that pops out of our modeling. Enormous expansion of wind and solar, all right? In the middle there, that blue and the yellow. And a huge reduction in natural gas. And the coal is completely gone, of course, right? And the nuclear still exists in this modeling in 2050, the 2 plants. So that's the New England grid when we get off of fossil fuels mostly, all right? This is a 90% decarbonization relative to 1990. So it's not net zero unless you find some other things to count. We did our modeling, we looked at 80, 90, 99, 95, and 99. And I'm just showing you the 90%. What you don't notice clearly on that grid, on that chart, but I'm going to highlight for you, is those net imports. They shrink. Because you're no longer treating Quebec as baseload and just always importing 2 gigawatts. You're sometimes importing gigawatts, sometimes exporting gigawatts, right? So that's what I mean about thinking about this system as different. Now, of course, we have other results in the paper. In the paper, we actually want to expand transmissions. So we show that from a cost perspective, you want to expand transmission. And so, those are slightly different results and such. But let's stay focused on this one particular situation. Let me try to emphasize that I am not saying New England does not need Canadian hydropower. It needs it desperately, but it needs to get the benefit of using it differently. When it imports, it needs the power badly. When it exports, New England is full of tons of power that we don't need, and we can give it to Quebec. All right? I mean, it'd be commercial arrangements, but we don't need it. So the price is going to be less. Both sides are going to benefit out of this. This is the lowest cost system for all of New England and New York and Quebec. So this maximizes the value of Quebec's hydropower. Even though it has fewer net imports to New England, the imports are more valuable than if you just used it as a baseload facility. All right? So that's also what I mean. You can't be counting megawatt hours and saying, oh, Quebec is supplying less here. They're supplying less when it's not valuable and supplying more when it's terribly valuable. So they're an essential partner to the system that we build up in New England. And so that's really where I want you to start trying to think about how we utilize the system differently. So let me make one last effort to sort of help you think about how is this system different. And I want you to think batteries. And most everybody appreciates that batteries and renewables like wind and solar go together. They're complements. People who are advocating for more solar investments are usually advocating for more batteries. They're complements. It's good to have both of them. They don't think of batteries as competing against solar, right? They're not substitutes. The New England region has been putting batteries on the system. We have 377 megawatts of batteries that qualified as capacity in the most recent capacity market auction. So that's, many years of trying to get batteries into the system. We've got 377 megawatts, and that's an accomplishment. But New England already had a lot more battery than that. It's called pumped hydro storage. And I'm just highlighting a story from WBUR, our public radio station in Boston, about the Northfield Mountain pumped hydro system. The title there on the slide is the title of the BUR program. The largest battery is hidden inside a Massachusetts mountain. It's not a battery, it's pumped hydro storage. The things you see, so on the top right there is the reservoir, and the bottom left there are inside the mountain, the generators, which will take the water from the reservoir as it falls through the chutes and generate power. But that water is pumped up to the reservoir, right? So it's not rainfall that's producing that water. It's operating just like a battery. You charge it by pumping the water and putting it into the reservoir, and you discharge it by using the water out of the reservoir. We have those, and they're big, right? This facility is 1,168 megawatts, so almost 3 times all of the batteries we have been building, we already had in the form of pumped hydro storage, right? It's clearly a complement to wind and solar. You recharge this hydro reservoir the same way you recharge a battery when the wind and solar are plentiful. So I want you to think about Quebec hydro being a balancing resource for wind and solar, a battery, this huge battery up north. Now, it's not just a battery. To Quebec, it's a source of power. It's rainfall flowing into reservoirs and flowing down rivers, which provides them their power throughout the year. It's almost 98% from hydro. But because it's in these reservoirs, it has the capacity to be turned on and off just like a battery also. So it can provide two services. It can provide energy to Quebec and balancing performance to New England. We want that battery service from the Quebec reservoirs. That's what I want you to see. So I'm just going to close out by recalling this graph. The top line is what we do now. No, not the top line, the sort of darker line is what we do now. Base load, use of transmission. The lighter gray line is what I'm saying we need to find a way to get to in the future, where we're using the Quebec as a balancing resource. It's providing power, but it's taking power, right? So that's why I'm emphasizing two-way trade is a new thing. It's not what we do now. Just to emphasize, it's not only not what we do now, it's not what the contract Massachusetts has signed for the power that's the additional hydropower it's going to take from Quebec on the line going through Maine. That was a decision by our New England policymakers, in Massachusetts in particular, to say, treat hydro as a substitute. Where can we get the next megawatt of low carbon generation? The fastest way to get it is from Quebec. We'll sign a contract to take it. It continues this old strategy of using them as baseload. Once again, that's fine. The next steps are deploy, 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 and if we can get some hydropower immediately from them, let's get it. So building that transmission line will help lower carbon in New England. But once again, looking to 2050, the system should have a lot more wind and solar on it, a lot more variability. We need to find a way to transition away from baseload to using it as a balancing resource. So I'm going to end just by that old Apple campaign of think different. There's a lot of work to do to implement different, right? We run our markets in one way. Hydro-Quebec operates in its region in a different way, trying to create the protocols to utilize these things in the optimal way. That's not an easy negotiation to have happen. We need to make sure that if we're going to rely on them for balancing resources, they're going to be there when we need them. That requires some two-way commitment from our two regional organizations. That doesn't happen overnight. So this research puts on the table that that's a task we want to think about going forward to, and there's a lot of work to be done to get there. So thank you. Let me just mention this is work that was co-authored. I'm presenting it, but Emil Demanchev was a student of ours who did the lion's share of the work, and Joshua Hodge is also a colleague at our research center. So thank you very much for listening. I'll look forward to questions and answers and discussions.
Plenty of time for some questions and answers. I want to say, too, if you'd like a copy of Dr. Parsons' slides, you can throw your name on the sheet over here with Renewable Energy Vermont. Thank you again for letting us know about Dr. Parsons' work, and would love to hear your questions. Yes, please. Stand up and introduce yourself, please.
Chuck Reese Building Renovation. Can you clarify why Quebec would want our power, given that they produce so much? What's the advantage to them?
Because balancing resources are high value resources. So if I look at it from Quebec's point of view, I've got this huge set of reservoirs. How can I make the most money off of it? And if all they do is just send us the power all the time, there's a certain amount we'd be willing to pay for that. That's what they'll get. But if they are willing to do the work to make their system more responsive and sometimes take power and give power, we will be paying a lot to get the power when it's most valuable. And so it's going to be profitable to them. So you want to think about it from them. So for example, when we presented this to them, one of the comments I heard from them was, oh, yeah, well, not all of our reservoirs are yet controlled so that we could do that balancing. But that's an investment they could make, right? And you can say they'd be making it on our behalf, but making it because it profits them to serve us as a customer. So you're kind of moving up in the higher order of value-added products when you're providing a balancing resource. Sure.
Really appreciate your work in this field. I think these are the types of solutions we need more of. My name is Will Jeffries. I'm a Burlington resident. And I was curious if in your work in this field, if you've identified any opportunities for essentially a pilot project, something that could be a proof of concept for these ideas across borders between Quebec and the US. I know that this has been done many, many times in the past, of course, as you gave that example, but I was curious if there was a pilot for this type of policy that you'd identified in your work.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm not the one who will implement a pilot, but a bunch of people are already doing that. So, you know, for effect, I wanted to counter that here's how we do it now, the dumb way, here's how you should do it in the future, the smart way. There's an in-between. So the new contracts that New York signed for the Chippy transmission line, they have some flexibility embedded in them. So while overall New York wants to make sure they get a volume of power, there is some flexibility as to when that volume will flow and things like that. I think that's a starting point, but I don't think it goes anywhere near where we need to go. But so I think people are checking out if there are ways of benefiting that. You know, there are lots of institutional details that obstruct it. So that's why I was emphasizing that, you know, to make this a reality, we need to align our systems somehow. Exactly how there's a long discussion. Yes, sir.
In a wide range of timescales from seasons to seconds. How would that play a role in this proposal?
So our analysis was down to the granularity of hourly, nothing below that. So we were not talking about ancillary services, frequency, fast ramp, and things of that sort. I don't know the state of play on that. Other people can address to what extent these systems are able to perform those things. The main issue, even on what we did, that is not, so ours is a mathematical model. How well does it approximate reality? You know, the question is, to what extent can the people who operate the system look at the power that's scheduled to come in from Quebec, and, you know, they have to worry about stability, and what if a transmission line goes down, and then they've got to have other resources ready to schedule them, and the stability and the reliability depends on a whole number of protocols that I have not investigated. So I'm sure there are other people who are working on that. The ISO New England has been doing research into this since we did this first piece of it, because they're worried about all of the offshore wind coming and this balancing, and they're asking themselves, does this transmission grid as we've built it enable the balancing of that offshore wind? But I haven't done it. Yes, sir.
Hi, John. Kirk Kabrowski from UVM. You said that you had done some robustness testing on the model, and I guess that would take into account some of those things like, you know, there's been some issues around offshore wind and reliability and deployment rates and so on. Can you talk a little bit about the robustness? How widespread is this in terms of what we're seeing as our actual likely futures?
That's a good question. I'm going to go back to an earlier slide when I showed you the future New England system. It's got a lot of wind and a lot of solar. We are nowhere near building any of that wind and solar. So that's a big variable. How much are we really going to dedicate land resources to large-scale wind and solar facilities? Other people have mapped pathways towards net zero, which seriously constrain the amount of onshore wind and solar commitments. When you do that, you have less variability, you need less balancing. You still are clearly going to need balancing, but you need a lot less. So that's an example of one that is high variable. I think the other thing that's really high variable is electrification. Who knows how electrification is going to move how much electrification, both of cars and of building heating. And also in Quebec, they historically have done resistance heating, but are they going to adapt that? And what technologies are we going to implement, and how well are we going to coordinate our turning the vehicles, plugging the vehicles in at night and things of that sort. So I think that's another huge variable which would change a lot. You had a question here?
I'm Phil Duguay from Grid United. I'm embarrassed because I've met you a bunch of times, but I've never seen your beard before. So congratulations on the new beard.
COVID does wonderful things.
Yeah, I figured that. So based in Montreal, and I work for a Houston-based company. Since you did this study, now ISO New England is basically forecasting a lot more terawatt hours of production or demand. So I was wondering if you could just tell me how you chose that, and then I do have a follow-up question if you'll indulge me later.
So the study has several different scenarios. So we used the National Renewable Energy Labs. They put out something called the Electricity Futures Study, where they constructed hourly profiles for 2050 under different assumptions of electrification. And so we redid our study for a couple of their scenarios, in particular for their high electrification scenario. Although I would say my impression is, and I'm not that good at remembering these numbers, people seem to think their high electrification scenario is nowhere near what it might actually be. So maybe we didn't go high enough.
That's kind of what's going on everywhere across Canada right now. And provinces are waking up and saying, wow, we need way more clean energy capacity. And so I think that is one reason why Quebec would want to trade more electrons to get to those targets. So on that note, the New England governors and Eastern Canadian premiers met this week. Actually, they broke today in Quebec City. Imaginary scenario here. They call you up and they say, Dr. Parsons, we need you to help us figure out a market mechanism bridging across the various balancing authorities in the Northeast. How do we do this? And where would you draw inspiration from around the world, like different places that have kind of amalgamated their market structures?
The market structure, I think, is the hardest one of all. I mean, here in the United States, in regions like New England and New York, we already went through this back in the 1990s, and we decided on a certain way of giving open access to the transmission system and creating competition. That's what we now know as our wholesale markets. Quebec went stayed on a different trajectory, where they have a province-run power company for the whole system, and they don't run a external market. You know, they do optimization internally. Those two systems, we need to find a way that instead of bumping up against one another, we can integrate. That's a really tough challenge. So I'm interested in that challenge, and I said this was an ongoing research project, but it's really a tough challenge. And I think it's tough because it really demands that people, think of the other guy and think of alternative ways. Fundamentally, these two systems are trying to solve the same problem. We're trying to optimize the use of the grid. We're trying to find the cheapest cost generation. We're trying to find options for integrating all sorts of resources. But we've chosen different routes, and it's a very hard problem to tackle. I don't have any solutions for you today. Okay. In the back, you had a question.
Yeah, Ryan, UVM student. So with the application with putting these new solar and wind power turbines into Vermont, how is it going to be? Is there going to be any environmental impacts?
You're asking about the solar and wind farms. Are they going to have environmental impact? Okay, I'm not familiar with development of Lake Champlain itself for wind or such, but I think you guys know it much better than I do, but we have the same issues in my backyard. These facilities take up large amounts of land. They don't necessarily require the land be dedicated, so you can do things around all the windmills, but they cover a large expanse. There's public disputes about how much of that you want. I mean, in Vermont, you folks passed laws many years ago to create open space and to dedicate some of your resources to preserving open space. So I'm sure you folks are going to have some views about how those spaces get used. A small number of solar farms have been installed in Massachusetts. Nobody noticed at first, but then they start to notice. You do more and more. And so I think that's going to be a huge issue. Our governor just convened an organization to study infrastructure development for clean energy. It's going to be a real difficult challenge to try to figure out where and how you want. That's the main challenge for wind and solar, to my knowledge. I mean, there's another challenge of waste at the end, but that's a different issue.
And then Dr. Parsons may hang out for a few minutes. Sure. And have some time for some discussion afterwards. So, your choice.
Right here. Okay. Oh, no, the one in the white. Sorry.
So, based upon the assumptions, I think this all makes sense. But one of the assumptions is that hydropower in Quebec is a substitute. It's like a battery. And given the opportunity with extensive research and looking at these questions, Burlington Electric and the state of New York decided not to invest in hydropower because of the environmental consequences of the Great Well project and the LeBron project that preceded it. Your analogy of the battery storage with the hydro lake in New Hampshire, we could also look at and say, we could flood upstate New York. But the environmental disaster that would create wouldn't be acceptable in the United States. But that's really what Hydro-Quebec has done in their own backyard. And they've done it several times. So the assumption is that this is clean power and that it's carbon neutral power. And I think that's something that we as New Englanders and Vermonters who value the environment need to take a very careful look at as we examine all the options. It is an option, but it is a bit of a Faustian ball.
So there are a lot of things to unpack in what you raised. It's an important issue. Being from Massachusetts, we did flood a big piece of Massachusetts. There are several towns that are underwater in central Massachusetts. We did it to create fresh water for Boston and surrounding communities. That's our reservoir for delivering water to our neighborhoods. There are probably some people who complain about that still, but I don't remember them being a meaningful, in my time in Boston, which is long since when that was done, I haven't heard anybody bring it up, but I'm sure there are people who do. The bigger issue, which I think so let me just say, all hydropower projects involve a huge change in the landscape, in economic development, in all sorts of characteristics of the society. So they are all a major political decision. And people can take different stands on them. And that's true going back centuries. That's true in Lahore, Pakistan. Touchy subject. But the thing behind what you are saying that is probably the most important one now is carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. So you flood a territory that has biological plants there. They are going to be rot, and that rot is going to produce CO2 and methane, and that's going to go into the atmosphere, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So is hydropower low carbon? So in our initial paper, which you can find online at our research center, we discussed that in the very beginning. So It varies greatly by different reservoirs. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has produced an analysis of that globally and reported on it. There's a huge variance. Hydro-Quebec has documented a lot about their reservoirs, and which are relatively low in that general huge system. But what we are talking about is not really should we expand hydropower, but how to best use the existing hydropower. So if you and different people can decide whether or not to create the reservoirs or not, we're just saying if you're going to have them, how can we maximize the benefit out of them? So anyway, that's what we present.